Okay, part B of our lesson this morning in Isaiah 34, verses 3 and 4. Read with me. Their slain will be thrown out. Their dead bodies will send up a stench. The mountains will be soaked with their blood. All the stars of the heavens will be dissolved, and the sky rolled up like a scroll. All the starry hosts will fall like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. Excuse me. There is no more graphic depiction of destruction of the armies of the nations than what you'll find here in these two verses. The rotting corpses of these armies will become in themselves a monumental disaster for those who live on the earth. Reminds me of some history from our own nation in that great cataclysmic event we call the Civil War, the worst thing that ever happened to the people of this nation. In Gettysburg, in July of 1963, in the first 3 days of the month of July, Gettysburg witnesses a calamity in which 23,000 Union soldiers were killed and 25,000 Confederate soldiers were killed and left lying on the battlefield. In addition to this 48,000 humans, corpses in the battlefield, there were hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more horses that were used to draw carriages, caissons, and cannons that also died and were left buried, to be buried rather, not buried, but left lying open on the battlefield. This was a horrible carnage. Union and Confederate soldiers were pressed into the service of disposing of this sea of humanity. Now, the armies of the South had fled the battlefield, but their prisoners were kept, and they were handed shovels, and they were compelled to bury those who died. Photographers Gardner and Henry came to the battlefield, and they photographed the bodies swollen to the point that they were bursting open their clothing and their bodies as well. They talked about the stench in July. We're talking the 4th of July is when they went out into the battlefield to begin the burial process, which took weeks to complete. Those bodies laid out there in the hot sun in July. I know this is offensive to our sensibilities. It's horrible and hard to imagine. But this is nothing compared to what Isaiah envisioned. He foretells an even worse consequence coming by way of the judgment of God upon the armies of the world. And there's no one to bury their dead. There is an indescribable stench that accompanies this calamity. Rivers of blood are described as sweeping down the mountainside, symbolic of the magnitude of the battle. The scope and the numbers that die are depicted by this flow of blood, so great that it forms rivers. The dead rot in place where they fell, and there's no sympathetic burial detail for them, no graves. No, it's just bodies swelling and bursting, their garments bursting as nature begins to take them back to the soil from which Adam was made. In the history of man's experience, celestial bodies are constant. The sun, the moon, the stars, they all have their place. And it's so stable and predictable that they're used for navigation. Few things in our life are more reliable than these celestial bodies. You expect the sun to rise every day. You expect the moon to run through its cycles. And you expect the tides to be regulated by the position of the moon relative to the earth. And the stars are going to be in their place. By the way, the star, we call the Star of Bethlehem, the junction of two celestial bodies is going to be visible this December 25th. But Isaiah tells us here that these celestial bodies, these stars, the moon and the sun as well, are all going to be put into some chaotic status. We don't know exactly what it is, but John describes it also in his book Revelations. In Revelation 6, verses 12 through 14, where he talks about the opening of the sixth seal and the judgments that come from God. He says, I watched, beginning in verse 12 of Revelation 6, I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon was turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. And the sky receded like a scroll, rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. The outpouring of God's wrath is not only going to kill the nations of the world, but this wrath is going to shape the entire cosmos. The destruction that is being described here is going to actually begin long before it is witnessed by men. Let me explain why. The stars that we see out there twinkling in the sky, the light that our eyes use to see it, takes sometimes, depending on its position, millions of years to arrive. So what we see happening on that star in the way of solar flares and stars going black or stars exploding, which all can be seen by astronomers with the telescopes that we have today, those events happen eons before they're witnessed by men. So if we're going to see all these changes in the stars in the sky, those changes will have begun eons before we see them. Now think about that. That tells us that God will have set in motion, or has already set in motion, the changes in those celestial bodies that are being described as the stars falling to the earth like leaves or figs falling to the earth when they wither. So I think it's already on its way. It's already happened. And we're going to see it when God's time is fulfilled. We're unaware of it today, but when that day comes, we will see it. Now, you and I, believers in the church, we're going to go in the rapture. So we're not going to be here for that terrible judgment where God is breaking open those seals in the book of Revelations. We're going to be in heaven with the Lord. We're going to go to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And we are going to escape this judgment. But the world is being told about the judgment that is certain to come. In the book of Revelations, they're being told about it here in Isaiah 34. Now let's look at verses 5 through 7 as we read about the day of the Lord, the time that comes after the revelation of the rapture of the church. Verse 5. My sword was drunk, its fill in the heavens. See, it descends in judgment on Edom, and people I have totally destroyed. The sword of the Lord is bathed in blood, is covered with fat, the blood of lambs and goats, and fat from the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in Edom. And the wild oxen will fall with them, and the bull, calves, and great bulls. Their lamb will be drenched with blood, and dust will be soaked with fat. Edom is symbolic. Historically, the Edomites were perpetual enemies of Israel, always ready to join with anyone, any nation, or any tribe who would throw their forces against God's people. They would become the allies of the Edomites. Like the Persians today. When I talk about Persians today, I'm talking about the nation of Iran. There is nobody on the planet who is more completely devoted to the destruction of Israel than the Iranians, the Persians that live in Iran. They are completely driven by blind hatred for Israel, and they're willing to destroy themselves and expend all the resources of their nation to exercise an attack on God's people. These are symbolic of the enemies of God. That is the Edomites that we're reading about here. The people who will be subjected to the great judgment when it comes, and come it will, or shall, is a more appropriate word. Peter is not known for prophetic pronouncements, is he? But, like Isaiah, he does have some. In 2 Peter, chapter 3, there is a passage here that speaks of the judgment, the certainty of the judgment of God, in a passage worthy of our notice. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 13. Here's what he says. Pay particular attention to verse 9. He says, "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. And 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives. As you look forward to the day of God, and speed is coming, that day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven, a new earth, the home of righteousness." Peter, like Isaiah's vision of the judgment of Edom, which was symbolic of the same judgment, sees, just as John sees in his book of Revelation, the certainty of the judgment of God and its scope and its completeness. Isaiah sees all manner of beasts suffering death as the sweeping destruction comes on the earth. The animals committed no sin on their own. However, they're part of the domain of man. As a consequence, the earth and everything in it suffers under the curse that came upon mankind because of the sin of Adam. Mankind suffers, and the animals on the earth suffer. They all die. They all return to the dust, just like man does. John also sees the sweeping sword of the Lord reaping death and destruction in Revelations 19, verse 17 and 18, where John says, "And I saw an angel standing in the sun who cried in a loud voice to all the birds flying in midair, 'Come, gather together the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, generals, mighty men, of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, small and great.'" So, the birds, the scavengers of the sky, are invited to feast on the consequences of the great battle that God engages with the armies of the world, of the earth. They're invited to devour those bodies and the bodies of the horses or animals as well. Now let's go to verses 8 through 10. I'm hoping we get to chapter 35 in this lesson, but it's not looking good. Let's see what we can do. Verse 8 through 10, Isaiah 34. "For the Lord has a day of vengeance." He states it as a matter of fact, you see that? "For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of retribution, to uphold Zion's cause. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulfur. Her land will become blazing pitch, it will not be quenched night and day. Its smoke will rise forever. From generation to generation, it will lie desolate. No one will ever pass through it again. A day that God has chosen, a time and a manner predetermined by God. The rebellion of men against God and his people, well, that's going to be settled. They won't choose the time and place, but it will be settled. The consequences of their rebellion will be the utter and complete destruction of men and beasts and the environment in which they reside. Look at the description of what happens to Edom. This is the nature of the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's appropriate. What we see today, leading into this time, is a nation, a world, not just a nation, whose social priorities, whose acceptable conduct, whose values and culture exactly resemble that of Sodom and Gomorrah. It is all repeated. And so shall the judgment be repeated. Fire from heaven, not a flood as with Noah's day, in keeping with the oath that God has taken. The preeminence of this judgment is certain. It does not pass as a short episode to be forgotten. It remains desolate, that is the place of the judgment, remains desolate for all future generations as a monument to their judgment. Instead, its smoke rises perpetually as a reminder. Go to Revelations chapter 14. I hope you are not wearing your fingers out turning pages. I'm glad you're doing that, though, because it's important to track with these readings, because they're so closely coupled to what Isaiah received as a revelation. Now in Revelations 14, verses 9 through 12. If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives his mark on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. You see, even though we're going to go into a blessed world filled with joy and expectation, there will be a residual reminder of the judgment and the perpetual burning and suffering, torment of those who rebelled against God and fall under that judgment. Verses 11 through 17, we only really need to read verse 12. Let's go to that. This is talking about, that is, this section is talking about how that desolate place that Edom will become will be fit only for animal and habitation. Verse 12 says, her nobles will have nothing there to be called a kingdom. All her princes will vanish away. The destruction of the country, that is the natural world, will be so complete that a people who gave no place to God in their lives will now have no place to live in this environment. But the environment reflects their judgment. No man is able or even willing to live or rebuild in that place. It's because the habitation now is fit only for animals, overgrown with weeds and thorns. And the destruction by fire, it becomes a habitation for beasts, symbolic of its complete desolation. Now we're in chapter 35. Yay! We get to read about good things. Our lesson study text takes us from verse 1 through 3. but I'm quickly running out of time, so let's look at verse 3, which is in your printed text. 3 and 4, actually. Strengthen the feeble hands. Steady the knees that give away. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong. Do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. In chapter 35, we're going to be reading here about the righteous, the contrast of the revelation of God's judgment against the unrighteous in chapter 34 with those described in 35. That is, the blessedness they receive, the vision of the future state that Isaiah has for them. It provides a source of hope and expectation. Isaiah's message tells them to be strengthened. He wants the physically weak be living in hope for a future renewal where their hands, which are weakened with arthritis or other maladies, will be healed and strengthened. Their knees, which are suffering and causing them to be lame, unable to be productive, will be healed and strengthened. Their failing hearts, which have been distressed by the conduct and the condition of the world that they lived in, will be restored as fear is wiped away. The source of this restoration and the courage and strength they're going to have is the coming of the Lord. On the one hand, they're going to see him coming in judgment of the world that has oppressed them. On the other hand, they will perceive that they are the recipients of blessings. They'll be seeing on the left the hand that brings judgment, a hand that they'll perceive as vengeance for the treatment they've received, and they'll basically perceive a payday for their oppressors, their tormentors. On the other hand, they're going to enjoy his salvation. Isaiah talks about the restoration of the land of Israel in verses 5 through 7. He says, then will eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. So the day of the Lord brings healing. Great miraculous healings, not just getting better from a cold. He talks about the blind receiving sight. He talks about the lame receiving healing to the point where they can leap like a deer. Their youthful vigor being completely restored. For a long time, many of these people's tongues have been silenced by oppression and censorship and fear of those around them who are their enemies. But now, in the day of the Lord, they will be freed from that oppression, and their tongues will be loosened to worship the Lord vigorously, joyously, proclaiming the Lord as Lord. The ground and the things that grow in it will be released from the curse of Adam's sin. You want to know why thorns grow? You want to know why the animals tear each other apart for survival and live by the slaying of other animals? It's because they are subject to the same curse that mankind is subject to because of Adam's sin. But all this is going to change in the day of the Lord. The ground and the things that grow in it are going to be released from the curse of Adam's sin. Paul writes about this in Romans chapter 8, verse 20 through 21. And again, another part of it. from 22 to 24. Let's look at this. This is an important clarification and expansion of what Isaiah has revealed. Paul says in Romans 8, 20 through 21, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So what frustrates the world? What frustrates the world is being subject to death. Just like mankind, they have no choice in the matter. And when they die, they return to the earth and turn into dust. But the animal kingdom is going to be released from this bondage of decay, as Paul writes, and they too are going to enter the glorious freedom that God has designed for his own children. Remember we read back there in the letter of John, where John says, and now we are the children of God. We don't know what we shall be. We don't know that we will be, but we know that we shall be like him. Well, this world that's coming, that Isaiah is describing, is being described by John as a time when the world is going to be released from the curse of Adam. Let's read verse 22 through 24 now, because this pertains to mankind. We know that while the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time, not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. Every single one of us here, and I know a lot of the people at home, suffer from just getting old. I can say that with a laugh because I suffer, because I know how you suffer. You know, old Arthur, he won't leave us alone. Arthritis, will he? And there are other maladies, all kinds of maladies that come with age. And the older we get, the more of our friends and loved ones we see pass on. All is a part of the judgment that was brought upon mankind by Adam. But Paul points out that we, as believers, have the first fruits of the Spirit. We have been given a life, a genuine life. We live while the world is dead. And not only do we live in the Spirit, but we are anticipating with great hope and anxious desire a coming resurrection of this body that will transform it from a body that suffers from these everyday maladies that come with getting old and other maladies as well. We will be delivered from that natural, dying, death-ridden body and given a body like the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. We shall share in the resurrection with him. This is our hope that comes with being saved. It's a true and genuine hope. So when we read about this judgment in Isaiah, and Isaiah is pointing to a time of joy and deliverance for Israel, when the desert's going to blossom, when rivers are going to flow in the desert, he's talking about the day when we receive our new heaven and new earth. Whether it's a completely new planet or whether it's a renovation of the existing planet, I don't know. But I know that it's going to be a new heaven and a new earth that is not going to be subjected to the curse that came with Adam's sin. That is a thing to cause joy. Yeah. So let's read this one last passage. Actually, well, I'm going to read it anyway. I'm in overtime. But in Isaiah 35, 8 through 10, and the highway will be there. It will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not journey on it. It will be for those who walk in that way. Wicked fools will not go about it. No lion will be there, nor will any ferocious beast get up on it. They'll not be found there.